Tonight, imagine a parlour bathed in the flickering glow of gaslight, its flame fluttering like a nervous guest at the edge of a velvet chair. The curtains are drawn heavy against the soot-streaked London dusk, yet faint whistles of a street organ drift through the cracks, playing tunes both cheerful and slightly off-key, like a drunk uncle at a wedding. A polished table stands in the middle of the room, crowded with the trinkets of polite domestic life. Silver-backed brushes, embroidered gloves, and, nestled neatly between a porcelain teacup and a bowl of candied violets, a small bottle of amber liquid. Its glass is stoppered tight, but the faint smell of bitter herbs and something darker creeps out, insinuating itself into the perfumed air. That bottle, dainty and harmless in appearance, is the quiet star of this story. You'd probably never make it through a single Victorian night, between the corsets, the coal smoke, and the diet consisting mostly of despair garnished with toast. But don't worry, I'll guide you safely through. So before we go any further, if this quiet company helps, you can gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Maybe lying awake in New York or drifting in a quiet room in London. Drop your time and place below so none of us feel alone tonight. Now dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey, together, here on Timeless Sleep. You lean back on the fainting couch, which was essentially the Victorian equivalent of today's yoga mat, except less comfortable and far more judgmental. The upholstery smells faintly of lavender sachets and dust, a combination designed to remind you both of serenity and of your own mortality. On the little walnut table at your side sits the bottle of laudanum, its label a masterpiece of polite deceit. For sleeplessness, female complaints, cough, indigestion, and nerves, it promises, which is essentially the 19th century way of saying, drink this, and you'll forget why you were upset in the first place. Perfumed bottles like this found their way into nearly every Victorian household, sometimes kept discreetly in the back of a drawer, sometimes displayed openly like a fashionable accessory. It was the era's favourite multitasking miracle, able to soothe headaches, lull fretful babies, and transform the crushing boredom of an afternoon into a foggy, dreamlike haze. Imagine scrolling endlessly through Netflix's Are You Still Watching screen, except instead of episodes of a sitcom, you have teaspoon after teaspoon of opium, sugar and alcohol blended to taste like bittersweet relief. Doctors prescribed it liberally, with the enthusiasm of someone handing out mints at a party. Women, in particular, became its loyal customers. The endless parade of nervous complaints, which range from actual chronic pain to the very real exhaustion of running a household without electricity, running water, or personal boundaries, found a ready solution in a few drops of amber elixir. The fainting couch wasn't only for show, it was a necessary landing pad after a day of childbearing, corset wearing, and emotional restraint so tight you could bounce a penny off it. Picture yourself in that parlour again. The clock ticks with a sanctimonious tone, reminding you that time in the 19th century belonged to punctuality, not pleasure. You've had your small dinner, perhaps a sliver of mutton, a boiled potato, and the hope of dessert that never arrived, and you settle in for the evening. Beside you, the laudanum bottle waits like a loyal but somewhat sinister companion. A teaspoon stirred into your tea, and suddenly your aches soften, your mind drifts, and the noise of children quarrelling 2 rooms over fades into something that feels like a distant theatre performance you didn't buy tickets for. Historians tell us that perfumed bottles of laudanum were sold as readily as hairpins or soap, their price low enough that middle-class and even working-class households could afford them. One advertisement boasted that a small bottle cost less than a loaf of bread, which tells you 2 things. 1, bread was unreasonably expensive, and 2, people were quite willing to swap nutrition for narcotics. The bottles themselves were designed to inspire trust. Curvy glass, embossed lettering, sometimes a faint floral etching, all the signals that said respectable remedy, rather than highly addictive substance smuggled into your bedtime routine. Victorian women often treated these bottles as part of their personal arsenal, tucked alongside the vinaigrettes. those little silver cases with pungent salts to prevent fainting, smelling bottles, and powders that promised a complexion like marble, but usually delivered rashes. The laudanum, though, worked reliably, until it worked too much. A few teaspoons dulled the edges of pain. A few more carried you into a realm where waking and sleeping blurred into a single soft grey. It was the drug of both survival and surrender. The ghostliness of Victorian womanhood, often described in novels as pale, delicate, and fragile, wasn't merely a matter of candlelight and tuberculosis. It was also the result of countless women quietly sipping from these bottles, their cheeks hollowing, their eyes shadowed, their vitality slowly exchanged for a promise of peace. Imagine a society that praises you for looking like you've already half drifted out of this world, and then hands you the liquid recipe for exactly that aesthetic. It's like today's obsession with no makeup looks, except instead of concealer, you're working with a narcotic cocktail. You glance at the bottle again, its amber glass glowing faintly like a miniature sunset. The liquid inside smells faintly bitter, medicinal, and oddly sweet, the kind of scent that could pass for herbal tea until it grips the back of your throat, with a reminder that this isn't chamomile, it's something older and more dangerous. Still, you stir it into your tea with the same casualness as adding sugar, and in this moment, you understand how so many women found themselves slipping quietly into a haze, praised for their serenity even as their strength ebbed away. The fainting couch cradles you as you sink lower, the room stretching and softening around you. The wallpaper's pattern of flowers seems to lean forward, almost blooming in the dim gaslight, while the ticking clock becomes a slow heartbeat, reminding you that time doesn't matter so much when you're comfortably numb. Somewhere outside, the wheels of a carriage clatter against cobblestones, but here inside, your body feels as though it's floating just slightly above the upholstery. One contemporary diarist confessed that she kept her laudanum bottle near at hand not only for pain, but also for what she called the heaviness of living. That phrase alone could earn its own Netflix special. The heaviness of living, in an era where women's lives were constricted by corsets, by endless pregnancies, by rigid expectations, and by the iron bars of propriety disguised as lace. In that heaviness, the perfumed bottles offered something like a reprieve, a borrowed softness against the harshness of the day. Of course, not everyone saw it so romantically. Satirical magazines lampooned the habit, sketching women collapsed on couches with half-empty bottles nearby, their faces slack as though they'd melted under the weight of too much leisure. Critics wrote essays warning of ghostly wives drifting about the house, more spectral than spirited. Yet these same critics often ended their tirades with advertisements for patent medicines, some of which were simply laudanum in prettier packaging. It was a cultural case of do as I say, not as I dose. You let your eyes wander across the parlour, where every object tells on you. The embroidery hoop half finished on the side table suggests patience, virtue, and a life so uneventful that stitching roses on fabric passes for entertainment. The piano in the corner gleams under a shawl, waiting to be played for polite guests who pretend to enjoy Schubert, but are secretly wondering whether the cook remembered to prepare supper. And then there's that bottle, discreet, elegant, perfumed, the object that quietly defines the entire scene. Inhaling, you notice how the room smells different now. Lavender sachets mixing with the faint chemical tang of the tincture, coal smoke curling from the fireplace like a sullen cat, and beneath it all, the sweet sour note of candied violets dissolving slowly in your mouth. Victorian sensory overload, wrapped in a genteel bow. Your body feels heavy and light at once, as though the fainting couch might at any moment decide to swallow you whole. Perfumed bottles and fainting couches, those twin emblems of Victorian womanhood, were both stages and props in a performance of fragility. To faint gracefully, to revive delicately, to sip a draught of laudanum with the soft resignation of someone posing for a portrait. All of it contributed to the strange theatre of 19th century femininity. You were expected to appear ethereal, translucent, almost ghostly, and here the drug offered a convenient shortcut. Why cultivate delicate nerves when you could purchase them by the bottle? So you sink back deeper into the fainting couch, your body half weightless, the bottle gleaming faintly beside you like a mischievous confidant. Somewhere in this parlour the line between cure and curse blurs until it's as thin as the lace veil you wear to church, sheer enough to see through, fragile enough to tear with a careless tug. And as the gaslight flickers, you begin to understand why so many Victorian women slipped quietly, almost willingly, into that ghost-like existence. The bottle shifts in your hand, a little heavier than it should be for something sold as casually as a box of biscuits. Tonight you notice the glass glows faintly in the lamplight, a golden-brown halo that might almost be comforting if you didn't know what it held. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, usually sherry, was the staple that turned Victorian medicine cabinets into something resembling a cocktail bar designed by ghosts. And it wasn't just the genteel ladies who kept it close. By the mid-19th century, laudanum bottles were as common on shelves as salt jars, each promising quick relief for nearly everything a body could complain about. On the pharmacy counter, rows of these bottles stood neatly arranged, their labels a polite mixture of reassurance and vagueness. For all ailments of the stomach, one would say. Another might advertise itself as a soothing draught for coughs, nerves, and night terrors. Translation: whatever you're going through, just drink this and stop bothering us. Some even arrived in dainty embossed bottles shaped like little flasks, designed to slip discreetly into a reticule or a coat pocket. You might call it convenience. I'd call it the world's most dangerous handbag accessory. Imagine yourself walking down a bustling Victorian street. Horses clatter, hawkers shout, coal dust paints everything in shades of industrial grey. But amid the chaos, there's comfort in knowing that just a few drops from that bottle can turn the volume down on reality. Sleeplessness, a teaspoon, a toothache, 2 teaspoons. Grief, exhaustion, or the creeping suspicion that your corset is plotting against you. Go on, pour a little more. No wonder laudanum became the era's default coping mechanism. It was cheaper than a doctor's visit, more socially acceptable than gin, and infinitely more fashionable than just admitting you needed rest. Pharmacies themselves became theatres of strange commerce. Imagine a long wooden counter lined with jars of powders and oils, each carefully labelled in looping script. Behind it, a pharmacist, waistcoat buttoned, spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, compounding remedies with the precision of someone who has absolutely no idea what dosage counts as safe. He measures laudanum into a vial, corks it neatly, and slides it across the counter with the same air as someone offering you a peppermint. It was medicine, yes, but it was also business, and business thrived. By the 1860s, laudanum use in Britain was staggering. Records suggest that some towns went through hundreds of gallons a year, with women leading the demand. Doctors described laudanum as a cure for female troubles, a phrase so broad it could cover anything from menstrual cramps to the existential dread of realizing your entire wardrobe involves 20 buttons and a chaperone. Men, too, took it, but society framed women's dependence on it as more elegant. After all, fainting delicately after sipping a tincture seemed refined, while slurring your words after gin looked vulgar. Victorian sexism, always ready to assign aesthetic points even to addiction. Picture a young mother at her dressing table, the mirror framed by wilted flowers and tiny glass bottles. The children are coughing in the next room, their cries stretching thin against the walls like violin strings pulled too tight. She dips a spoon into the laudanum bottle, stirs it into sugar water, and tips it gently into their mouths. Silence follows, sweet and heavy. She leans back, exhales, and takes a little herself, the taste sharp and syrupy on her tongue. For her, this isn't indulgence, it's survival. Without it, the house would ring with endless unrest. With it, at least for a while, she can breathe. And yet, what's survival to one person looks like scandal to another. Newspapers occasionally ran stern warnings about the dangers of opium, their tone the literary equivalent of wagging a finger. But just as often, the very same papers featured cheerful advertisements for patent medicines that contained exactly the stuff they scolded. It was a cultural two-step: condemn laudanum in editorials, promote it in classifieds. Imagine modern newspapers running a front-page exposé on fast food, then 3 pages later, advertising discount burgers. Victorians weren't hypocritical, they were just very efficient at compartmentalising. The popularity of laudanum was so immense that even literary giants got in on the action. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet behind Kubla Khan, openly admitted that much of his work came to him under opium's spell. Thomas de Quincey wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turning his habit into a bestseller. If you think about it, this was the 19th century version of glamorizing your burnout on social media. Look at me, I'm falling apart, but artistically. And while readers clutched their pearls at the scandal, many quietly marked the book with recipes for tinctures in the margins. Still, the everyday reality wasn't glamorous. Housewives and working women alike lined their shelves with little bottles, dosing themselves to endure endless tasks. A servant girl facing 14-hour days in a smoky kitchen might take a spoonful to keep going, the haze turning drudgery into something at least bearable. A factory worker, worn thin by spinning machines and meagre meals, might do the same. Laudanum democratized suffering, packaging relief into bottles that blurred class lines even as they deepened dependency. As you sit back on that parlour-fainting couch, you can almost feel the bottle pulsing faintly with its hidden power. It doesn't just quiet pain, it rearranges your hours. Time feels less jagged, less relentless. The long evenings of needlework stretch smoother, the headaches ease, the dull ache of disappointment in a marriage arranged more for family. Property than love softens into something you can endure. Laudanum becomes a private bridge between duty and desire, a liquid hush poured carefully into porcelain cups. Even the way it was administered carried an elegance that disguised its dangers. A spoon dipped, a teaspoon stirred into tea, a delicate swallow. It all looked genteel, no different from sipping elderflower cordial or rosewater lemonade. But beneath that veneer, the doses stacked quietly, creeping up as tolerance grew. What began as half a teaspoon might, over the months, become 3. And as women sipped their way to serenity, they also sipped closer to dependency. But in the language of the day, they weren't addicts. They were delicate, refined, prone to nerves, ghostliness disguised as grace. The bottles themselves carried stories. Apothecaries sometimes added perfumes or floral essences to soften the taste, turning each dose into a strange hybrid of medicine and dessert. Imagine swallowing something bitter, then catching a faint aftertaste of rose petals. It was a sensory contradiction, much like the whole of Victorian life, a world that demanded rigid moral virtue but quietly thrived on indulgences whispered about behind lace curtains. And in those whispers, laudanum became a silent companion. Women shared tips at tea tables. Which patent syrup calmed colicky infants fastest? Which concoction dulled cramps most effectively? Which brands left you with the least pounding headache afterward? They passed bottles across parlours like secret notes, their laughter delicate, their eyes just a little too shadowed. Imagine Instagram influencers swapping skincare tips, except the glow here wasn't from serum, but from the faint pallor of steady opium use. Doctors, for their part, fueled the trend with prescriptions as abundant as wallpaper patterns. Some wrote them reflexively, the way we might click accept cookies without reading the fine print. And why wouldn't they? Each prescription was a sale, and sales meant profit. Besides, it was easier to hand a woman a bottle than to listen to her complaints about exhaustion, grief, or the crushing repetition of domestic life. Why unpack misery when you could just cork it in a bottle and sell it back as a solution? The sound of the clock in the parlour grows louder in your imagination, each tick a reminder of how much time laudanum reshaped. Nights blurred into mornings, mornings into afternoons, until whole days disappeared into soft oblivion. The drug was a thief of hours, but it was also a balm for them. In its haze, the weight of expectation lifted. Even just for a little while you could forget that your existence was defined by lace collars, good manners, and the constant hum of repressed desire. Looking back now, it seems almost inevitable that laudanum would entangle itself so deeply in Victorian life. It wasn't just a drug, it was a social glue. It kept mothers calm, children quiet, workers functional, and the whole fragile structure of the household intact. Without it, the complaints of daily life might have been unbearable. With it, Everything ran just smooth enough to look respectable. But that smoothness carried a cost, one that became visible only in the hollow eyes, the faint complexions, the ghostly figures gliding silently through drawing rooms. Tonight, you imagine holding that little bottle yourself, tilting it gently, watching the liquid inside catch the light. It promises everything you want to hear: relief, rest, reprieve. But as the bottle warms in your hand, you realize it's less a cure and more a pact. A deal struck quietly between you and oblivion. And in the quiet flicker of the gaslight, you begin to understand why Victorian shelves were lined with these amber ghosts, why women reached for them with steady hands, and why the line between medicine and poison blurred so fatally in the glow of everyday life. The corset squeezes against your ribs, like a judgmental aunt, reminding you that breathing is optional, but proper posture is not. You shift on the fainting couch, one hand absent-mindedly resting on the amber bottle nearby. The room feels hushed, its gaslight glow mellowed into something soft, almost dreamlike. Somewhere, muffled by thick velvet curtains, a carriage rattles past on cobblestones, the horse's hooves clapping like impatient applause. Yet here inside, silence stretches, heavy and expectant. Your body aches, not just from the corset, but from the sheer exhaustion of being expected to float through life as if you were spun from lace and good manners. And here, the doctors tell you, is your solution: a draught of laudanum for delicate nerves. Victorian medicine loved that phrase. Delicate nerves. It covered everything, really. Fatigue, sadness, pain, grief, anger, all conveniently reduced to a matter of nerves behaving badly. Doctors spoke of hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis, as slippery as a bar of soap in a public bath. Women, they said, were particularly susceptible. After all, what else could explain the constant fainting, the headaches, the sudden bursts of tears, the bone-deep tiredness? Surely not the endless pregnancies, the lack of rights, the unrelenting labour of managing households while draped in 40 pounds of skirts. No, the problem was nerves. And the cure, Laudanum. You picture yourself seated in a doctor's office, the wallpaper patterned with ferns that look more judgmental the longer you stare at them. The doctor, grey whiskers, pince-nez spectacles, and an air of weary authority, scribbles a note with such casualness you'd think he was recommending a brisk walk. A teaspoon with tea, he murmurs, barely looking up. For sleep, for pain, for the general agitation of the feminine constitution. Translation: I haven't got time to hear your life story, please drink this, and make both of us feel better. Doctors prescribed opiates with a frequency that would make today's pharmacists faint into their own counters. They believed it calmed women, soothed hysteria, and restored tranquility to households that might otherwise boil over with nerves and suppressed rage. And in a way, it worked. Women who drank laudanum often did become quieter, calmer, more compliant. A wife fretting about her 15th pregnancy could be soothed into silence. A widow mourning too loudly could be hushed with a tincture. A daughter rebelling against her strict schooling could be rendered docile by the spoonful. It was not just a medicine, it was a tool of social control disguised as care, and society applauded. Fragility became fashionable. Women who appeared pale, hollow-eyed and languid were described as elegant, refined, ethereal. To look ghostly was to look virtuous. Never mind that behind the pallor was a steady intake of narcotics. Literature of the era is full of such descriptions: heroines with faint voices, translucent skin, trembling hands. To be strong was unladylike. To be fragile was a mark of distinction. You didn't just drink laudanum to cure hysteria. You drank it to embody the very aesthetic society demanded of you. Imagine stepping into a parlour full of women, each reclining on fainting couches, each pale as if painted in watercolour rather than flesh. Their voices drift softly, like whispers in a cathedral. They talk of their nerves, their fatigue, their sleeplessness. And though no one says it outright, many of them share the same amber secret, a bottle tucked discreetly in a pocket or a drawer. It is a quiet conspiracy, a collective agreement to float through life as if half transparent, Corsets amplified the illusion, laced so tightly you could barely eat more than a biscuit without swooning. They pressed lungs into obedience, ribs into submission. Breathing shallowly, women looked delicate, as though life itself was too heavy for them. Add laudanum, and you became not just delicate but spectral, drifting through hallways with the softness of someone barely tethered to the world. It was fashion and pharmacy working hand in hand. Constrict the body, numb the spirit, and present the result as refinement. One woman, a diarist of the 1850s, described her doctor prescribing laudanum for the heaviness of melancholy and the nervousness of wifehood. She wrote of feeling as though she were living in fog, a haze that made daily duties blur at the edges. Yet her husband praised her new quietness. More agreeable, he called her, as if docility were the highest form of affection. Imagine the irony. Women praised for their beauty precisely as they vanished into ghostliness. This wasn't just personal. It was systemic. Doctors published papers extolling the virtues of opium for women's ailments, citing case after case where a teaspoon quieted the restless, soothed the grieving, or softened the irritable. Some even suggested laudanum could restore balance to the female temperament, which was medical code for please stop crying at dinner parties. And while some doctors expressed concern about long-term use, many brushed it aside. After all, what was the alternative? Listening to women talk about their lives? Better to prescribe silence in liquid form. The connection between laudanum and hysteria diagnoses ran deep. Hysteria itself was a diagnosis rooted not in biology but in cultural anxieties about women stepping outside their prescribed roles. Women who resisted marriage, who mourned too openly, who grew too intellectual, all risked being labelled hysterical. Laudanum provided the perfect solution. It didn't cure hysteria so much as erase it, or at least dull it into tolerable passivity, and so the bottles multiplied, tucked into handbags, displayed on vanities, carried discreetly in pockets. The strange part is how normal it seemed. Families boasted about their preferred tinctures the way people today brag about coffee blends. My wife takes Dover's powder, a gentleman might remark, as if discussing wallpaper. We find it most effective, and though whispers circulated about women becoming ghosts of themselves, the practice remained too convenient, too culturally embedded, to stop. After all, laudanum didn't just quiet nerves, it preserved appearances, and appearances were everything. You glance again at that corset wrapped tightly around you, bones pressing like stern fingers against your ribs. It wasn't just fabric, it was discipline made visible. Combined with laudanum, it created the illusion of a woman who needed constant care, constant protection, constant male oversight. Society applauded this helplessness, writing poems to it, painting portraits of it. Women became ornaments, beautiful, fragile, almost spectral, and many of them, under the steady haze of opium, began to feel like ornaments themselves, objects of display rather than subjects of their own lives. The cruelest part was how often the drug was given not for real ailments but for convenience. A crying wife, dose her. A restless daughter, dose her. A grieving mother, dose. Laudanum became a way to smooth over life's rough edges, not by fixing them, but by muting the women forced to endure them. It was Victorian noise cancelling, except instead of headphones you got a bottle that slowly hollowed you from the inside. As you drift on the fainting couch, the walls seem to close in, patterned wallpaper curling like vines, the gaslight flickering shadows that stretch too long. Your breath comes shallow, not entirely from the corset, but from the weight of expectation pressing invisibly against you. You realize the drug was not merely a medicine, but a stage direction. Enter the woman, pale and trembling. She reclines gracefully. She speaks softly. She disturbs no one. Laudanum helped women hit their marks in this theatre of fragility. But beneath the performance, the truth was stranger. Women were not weaker, not more fragile by nature. They were made fragile by corsets, by endless duties, by the denial of autonomy, and by the steady spoonfuls of opium poured into their teacups. They became ghostly, not because they were destined to, but because society required it, and gave them the tools to disappear gracefully. You picture again the doctor, scribbling quickly, sliding the bottle across the desk. His office smells of ink, leather, and faint medicinal bitterness. He doesn't see you as a patient, but as a puzzle piece in a social order that must remain undisturbed. Your fragility is useful, your ghostliness is convenient, and with each spoonful of laudanum, you slip further into the role society has written for you. A role performed not on stage, but in every parlour, every nursery, every drawing room of Victorian England. The bottle gleams in the gaslight, amber liquid swirling like trapped sunset. Your hand hovers over it, fingers brushing the cool glass. You know it brings quiet. You know it brings sleep, and you also know that with each dose, you lose a little more of yourself, trading vitality for tranquility, resistance for resignation. The corset tightens, the room hushes, the ghostly aesthetic takes shape, and so you take the spoon, stir, sip, swallow, and drift a little further into the haze that Victorians called refinement. The curtains in the parlour hang heavy, like velvet secrets that refuse to let the outside world in. You sit with your tea, the amber glow of the laudanum bottle balanced neatly at your elbow, its liquid catching the light like it's trying to look innocent. Outside, a neighbour's bell chimes the hour, but you've lost count of how many hours have slipped through these thick walls. The house feels hushed, too hushed, as if the silence itself has been medicated. That's the thing about these bottles. They don't just soften nerves, they soften entire households, until what should be bustling with clatter and conversation becomes a stage where everyone is pretending not to see the shadows gathering in the corners. You glance at the lace curtains, their patterns twisting delicately in the lamplight. To the casual eye, the household looks perfect. Polished furniture, genteel manners, daughters practicing scales on the piano, sons reciting Latin declensions like tiny future lawyers. But behind the lace, there are faint rings under eyes, conversations that trail off mid-sentence, and the sense that everyone is moving just slightly slower than reality. The shadow behind the lace is dependency, but polite society is too well-mannered to name it. Instead, the bottles are called remedies, and silence covers the rest. Imagine visiting a friend for afternoon tea. The table is set with sponge cake, seed biscuits, and little sandwiches with crusts cut off, the kind of polite snacks that taste like resignation dusted with sugar. You sip tea together, laugh softly about children's antics, compliment each other's shawls, and then, just as naturally as pouring cream, your hostess opens a small drawer and produces the amber bottle. With one hand she tips a spoon into her cup, with the other she slides the bottle back into hiding. No comment, no hesitation. You do the same. The unspoken rule is clear. It's not gossip if everyone is dosing themselves into forgetting. Polite society tolerated the shadows as long as they stayed discreet. Laudanum was acceptable as long as the curtains stayed drawn. The women stayed pale, but presentable, and the families looked respectable from the street. Addiction was a word whispered about sailors, criminals, or gamblers, never about the lady reclining on her fainting couch with a lace handkerchief pressed delicately to her temple. For women, the slow slide into dependency was reframed as refinement. Hollow eyes, a mark of ethereal beauty; unsteady steps, evidence of delicate health; hours of silence, proof of contemplative depth. Ghostliness became not a symptom but a style. The denial ran deep. Magazines published articles, scolding excess even while advertising tonics and tinctures spiked with opium. Doctors muttered about overindulgence in their journals, but still signed prescriptions by the dozen. Husbands grumbled privately about their wives' quietness, but praised their gentleness in public. It was a double game. Society both condemned and required the shadows, because without laudanum, the brittle structure of domestic life might crack. Without those bottles, women might demand real relief, or worse, real change. The shadows deepened most in the evenings. After dinner, a roast, some boiled vegetables, a pudding heavy with suet. Families retreated to the parlour. The children worked at their lessons under candlelight. Fathers read newspapers rustling like judgmental wings, and mothers poured just a little more into their tea. In those hours the air thickened, voices grew slower, laughter softer, silences longer. A visitor might think the household unusually calm, refined even. But if you looked closely, you'd see the glaze over the eyes, the way the piano notes faltered, the way a needlepoint hoop slid forgotten into a lap. Dependency had crept in like fog, unnoticed until it muffled everything. Think of how many lives played out this way. Women dosing themselves just enough to endure another evening, another conversation, another empty praise of their fragility. Some didn't stop at teaspoons. Some poured more, chasing a deeper quiet, drifting further until they became almost spectral presences in their own homes. They were there, but also not there. Voices thin, movements slow, vaescence ghost-like. And yet their families tiptoed around it, pretending not to see. After all, what was more dangerous? Admitting the bottle was hollowing their wives and mothers, or losing the fragile peace it brought? The most heartbreaking part was how society turned the shadows into ideals. Women weren't just allowed to fade, they were applauded for it. Novels described heroines with one beauty: soft languor, melancholy charm, pain, dependency, exhaustion, all packaged as romance. Imagine being rewarded, not for your vitality, but for your vanishing. That was the trick of the Laudanum age. Women became living metaphors of refinement, while in reality, they were simply slipping away. The curtains tremble faintly as a breeze sneaks through the sash. Shadows ripple across the room, stretching long, dark fingers over polished tables and faded rugs. You notice how those shadows mimic the bottles themselves. Small, ordinary things casting consequences far larger than their size. Every teaspoon poured created ripples. Quieter mothers, calmer households, more obedient daughters, but also emptier evenings, weaker bodies, hollowed spirits. The lace curtains flutter, but no one pulls them back. Better to let the shadows stay where polite eyes can't see. And in that denial the bottles multiplied. Patent medicine shops thrived, apothecaries prospered, and women's vanity tables gleamed with glass. To admit danger was to challenge the very fabric of Victorian life, and so the silence thickened. Dependency lived behind lace, disguised as elegance, praised as refinement. Women became shadows of themselves, moving quietly through rooms filled with gaslight and whispers. You lean back into the fainting couch, the upholstery smelling faintly of lavender and something sharper, something like despair. The bottle rests on the table, its liquid trembling slightly, as if aware of its own duplicity. Outside, the city hums. Wheels turning, factories grinding, voices shouting. But here inside, the air feels too still, too heavy. You realize you're not just imagining the shadows behind the lace curtains, you're sitting in them. They are everywhere, these shadows. In every household where laudanum was poured into tea, in every parlour where pale faces were praised, in every marriage where silence replaced conversation. And as the night deepens, you see that the shadows behind the lace are not accidents, but architecture, carefully woven into the fabric of society. Ghostliness wasn't just a side effect, it was a design. The gaslight flickers, and for a moment you think you see movement in the corner. Not a person, but a faint outline, a shape half-formed, like the echo of someone who used to be there. Maybe it's a trick of the light, or maybe it's the ghost of refinement itself, the lingering presence of all those women who faded politely behind curtains, their stories left untold, their bottles left empty. You sit quietly, feeling the room grow heavier, the shadows longer, the silence deeper, and you realize the lace curtains weren't just decoration, they were veils, both literal and metaphorical, covering what no one dared admit. Dependency thrived in that cover, unseen yet everywhere. And behind them, the women of Victorian England became exactly what society demanded: elegant, delicate, ghost-like, until there was almost nothing left of them at all. The nursery smells faintly of milk, damp linen, and that faintly sour tang of too many hours without fresh air. A rocking chair creaks under your weight as you settle, a restless infant bundled in your arms. The baby's cries come in waves, sharp and insistent, vibrating through the thin walls until the whole house seems to hum with fatigue. You have not slept in what feels like weeks, though in truth, it's only been 3 nights, and your arms ache from the endless rhythm of rocking. On the table beside you sits a spoon, a small bottle, and the faint promise of silence. The label on the bottle reads, Godfrey's Cordial. Another nearby reads, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. Both gleam innocently in the dim gaslight, their words whispering reassurance. Safe, gentle, soothing. What the labels don't say is that each spoonful carries opium, dissolved and sweetened, designed to lull even the loudest child into docile stillness. You hesitate, just for a moment, before dipping the spoon. The cries keep coming, loud enough to rattle your already frayed nerves, and then you do what thousands of mothers in Victorian England did every day. You stir the syrup into water, tip it carefully into the baby's mouth, and wait. Within minutes the cries soften, then fade. The baby's breathing slows, his body growing heavy in your arms. The house exhales with you. Finally, silence. Relief. It feels like magic, though in truth, it is chemistry. Patent medicines like Godfrey's Cordial or Paregoric were sold everywhere, often advertised as cures for teething, colic, restlessness, and any other ailment that could keep a child awake. The dosages weren't carefully measured. Often they depended on how tired the mother was, how loud the child cried, or how much sleep the household had already lost. Some bottles were sweetened with molasses, others flavoured faintly with herbs to mask the bitterness, but all carried the same active ingredient, opium. For working-class mothers, especially, these syrups became survival tools. Imagine living in a cramped tenement, laundry steaming in the hearth, half a dozen children running wild while you stitched shirts by candlelight to earn pennies. Sleep was a luxury you couldn't afford. Peace and quiet were luxuries you couldn't even imagine. But with a few drops of soothing syrup, the house quieted, the baby slept, and the day stretched smoother. Of course, the cost came later, in stunted growth, weakened bodies, or worse. But in the moment, when exhaustion pressed like iron against your skull, the syrup felt like salvation. Newspapers occasionally printed warnings. Doctors muttered about infant mortality linked to soothing syrups, yet the bottles kept selling. The advertisements painted them as household miracles. Mothers, rest easy. No more endless crying. No more sleepless nights. Give your child relief and keep your household calm. The language was soothing, just like the syrup itself. And though tragedies occurred, infants overdosed, weakened or failed to thrive, the cultural silence held. To speak openly of the dangers was to admit that the entire structure of motherhood rested on bottles of poison. Imagine the scene repeated in households across the city. A mother spooning syrup into a baby's mouth before leaving for her shift in the mill. A grandmother passing down recipes for homebrewed cordials, blending laudanum with honey and herbs. A nursemaid dosing the children of wealthy families so she could slip away to gossip in the kitchen. Opium blurred not just pain but also time, turning endless hours of crying into long stretches of sleep. The babies became quieter, the households calmer, the women more able to survive another day. And in that silence, danger spread quietly, just as surely as shadows behind lace curtains. You look down at the baby in your arms, his breathing steady now, his tiny face slack with deep, unnatural sleep. His stillness feels peaceful, but it also unsettles you. There's something eerie about the way his limbs dangle, boneless, as though he's a doll rather than a child. And though you know he'll wake later, perhaps hungry, perhaps drowsy, you cannot shake the sense that each spoonful steals something, a fragment of vitality, a sliver of strength. But exhaustion presses harder than guilt. You lean back in the rocking chair, close your eyes, and drift. Soothing syrups became so embedded in Victorian life that entire generations grew up on them. Some children survived the steady dosing, but carried with them frail constitutions, their bodies weakened by years of narcotics. Others did not survive at all. Infant mortality was already high in the 19th century, and opium-laced remedies only added to the toll. Yet mothers, trapped in cycles of poverty and exhaustion, kept pouring spoonfuls. What else could they do? Society offered little support beyond judgment. A crying child was seen as a failing of motherhood. A quiet child, no matter how unnatural the quiet, was a mark of success. The paradox is bitter. Victorian culture idolized motherhood, painting it as the pinnacle of feminine virtue, while at the same time refusing to make it survivable. Endless childbearing, constant domestic labor, no real medical care, no social safety nets, and then blame when the burden grew too heavy. So mothers reached for the bottles, not because they wanted to harm, but because silence, even bought by opium, felt kinder than constant chaos. And so babies grew up half dreaming, mothers half ghosts, households suspended in a drugged calm that masked the relentless weight of survival. Picture again the advertisements. Smiling babies, beaming mothers, glowing promises of peace. They were printed in magazines, pasted on walls, slipped into newspapers. No one mentioned the drowsy eyes, the limp limbs, the coffins so small they could be carried under one arm. The reality stayed hidden, politely ignored. The public story was that soothing syrups were progress, science, modernity, proof that life could be made easier, calmer, quieter. The private story was that mothers wept over tiny beds, whispering that they had only meant to help. The nursery clock ticks on, loud in the silence. The fire burns low, its embers glowing like tired eyes. You feel the baby's weight growing heavier, your own eyes drooping with exhaustion. The room blurs. Somewhere outside, footsteps pass on the cobblestones, muffled by fog. Inside, the stillness feels absolute. For now at least, the crying has stopped, and in that fragile silence, you understand why mothers reached for the bottle again and again, even knowing it carried shadows in every drop. But shadows, once invited, rarely leave quietly. Children grew up accustomed to doses. Mothers became accustomed to the calm. Families forgot what an undrugged night sounded like. And so, generation after generation, the bottles remained. Soothing syrup wasn't just a remedy. It was an inheritance, passed down like recipes, like lullabies, like the faint ghostliness that crept into the very bones of Victorian households. You rock slowly in the chair, the baby asleep, the bottle gleaming faintly on the table. The shadows lengthen on the nursery walls, stretching like soft warnings. And as you drift in your own drowsiness, you realize the truth. Soothing syrup didn't just hush babies, it hushed entire lives, entire families, entire histories. And in that hush, the sound of what was lost could never quite be heard again. The apothecary smells of camphor, fennel, and a lingering sweetness that makes your nose twitch, as if it knows secrets are being kept in plain sight. Wooden shelves line the walls from floor to ceiling, each crowded with jars, bottles, and canisters, labelled in elegant script. Tinctura opiae, spiritus ammonia, pulvis ipecacuanae. A brass scale gleams on the counter, balanced precariously between honesty and profit. You push open the door and the little bell above jingles, a cheerful sound at odds with the solemnity of what's being sold here. The apothecary himself looks up, waistcoat neat, spectacles fogged from the steam of his pestle and mortar, and greets you with a nod that suggests you're about to conduct perfectly respectable business. After all, what could be more normal than buying bottled dreams by the ounce? The counter is crowded with patent medicines, brightly labelled boxes, promising vigour, vitality, or relief. Bateman's drops, Dalby's carminative, paregoric elixir. Each one carries, in smaller letters, an ingredient list no one bothers to read too closely. Opium, morphia, alcohol, the trifecta of calm. Imagine today's pharmacy shelves, where half the cough syrups came spiked with something strong enough to turn Netflix and chill into Netflix and coma. And yet, in Victorian England, this was not scandalous. It was commerce. You step closer, drawn to the array of bottles in shades of green, brown, and clear glass. Some are dainty, designed for ladies' dresses. Others are sturdy, meant for households that bought in bulk. Because who wants to run out of oblivion in the middle of a Tuesday? A label catches your eye. For all disorders of the nerves, stomach, and constitution. The word constitution is doing Olympic-level work here. It means absolutely everything, and nothing at once. Stomach cramps? Yes. Anxiety before meeting your in-laws? Of course. General despair about the coal soot that seems to infiltrate your very soul. Drink up. Behind the counter, the apothecary grinds powders, mixes tinctures, corks vials with a professional air. But don't mistake the neatness for caution. Dosages vary wildly. One customer might receive a draft strong enough to knock out an ox. Another might get a diluted version because the shop is running low. There are no warning labels, no child-proof caps, no regulatory boards ensuring safety. The only real guarantee is that, for a few hours, you will feel less of whatever you were feeling before. The shop hums with customers. A labourer's wife, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, buys a vial for her husband's cough. A pale clerk requests drops for nervous digestion. A weary mother asks for Godfrey's cordial, muttering about sleepless twins. Each transaction is conducted with the same politeness as buying bread. The bottles pass from counter to pocket, from apothecary's ledger to household shelf, disappearing into the bloodstream of society. You can almost hear the voices of the era's critics echoing faintly among the jars. Some reformers warned that apothecaries were turning into pharmacies of powdered dreams, their shelves stacked with poisons disguised as panaceas, but those voices were often drowned out by the louder jingles of commerce. Every bottle sold meant profit, and profit carried more weight than warnings, and besides, who wanted to challenge a system that made life more bearable? The apothecary himself is part businessman, part confidant, part magician. He knows who buys what, and how often. He knows which families rely on weekly bottles, which women request extra for nerves, which men disguise their dependence by pretending it's for their wives. He sees the shadows forming, but doesn't name them, because naming them would mean losing customers. And in a city where everyone wants silence more than truth, business is brisk. The packaging does its own sleight of hand. Labels boast of herbal ingredients or time-honored remedies, hiding the opium under layers of floral illustrations and reassuring script. Some bottles are perfumed, the bitterness softened by lavender or rose, so that each sip feels like drinking a garden party, until the haze descends and you forget the garden, the party, and why you needed them in the first place. Imagine reaching for a bottle in your own parlour. You don't think of it as a drug. You think of it as routine, like buttering toast or winding the clock. You unscrew the cork, the faint whiff of alcohol and herbs rising up. You pour carefully, stir into tea. The bitterness is masked, just enough to make you wonder if you imagined it, and within minutes, your body softens, your thoughts slow, the edges blur. It feels less like a dose, and more like slipping under a quilt. But quilts warm only for a while, and Laudanum's quilt smothers as much as it comforts. Dependence creeps in gradually. A teaspoon becomes 2, then 3. Bottles are empty faster, orders placed more frequently. The apothecary nods knowingly, perhaps raises an eyebrow, but never refuses, after all. You are a paying customer. And in Victorian England, a customer's comfort weighed more heavily than their long-term health. Even the architecture of the apothecary shop reflects this strange mixture of respectability and danger. Polished wood, gleaming glass, brass fixtures, everything suggests propriety, trust, science. Yet the very shelves are lined with what amounts to legal intoxication. It's like walking into a chapel, only to realize all the candles are made of dynamite, but the illusion holds, because everyone agrees to keep pretending. You notice the ledger on the counter, ink stains spreading like small shadows across its pages, names, dates, amounts. A whole community mapped out in careful handwriting. Each line a quiet confession. Here is Mrs. P, ordering another vial for her delicate nerves. Here is Mr. J, purchasing for his wife, but sneaking extra drops for himself. Here are the children's cordials, ordered with the same casualness as barley sugar. The ledger doesn't judge. It simply records the flow of amber liquid from shelf to mouth to silence. Outside, the world rattles on. Carriages roll past, chimney sweeps call, factory bells clang. Inside, the apothecary offers escape bottled neatly with cork and label. The clatter of life is reduced to a soft hum, manageable, tolerable, for a price of course, always for a price. And as long as people keep paying, the shelves will stay full, the bottles will keep gleaming, and the city will keep drifting, just a little closer to ghostliness. It's easy to imagine how the apothecary's shop became not just a place of purchase but a ritual. Women entered with weary faces, left with bottles tucked discreetly in baskets. Men entered under pretense, left with something to soften their own fatigue. Children peered at the shelves, marveling at the rainbow of bottles, not knowing how many of those bottles were already shaping their lives. And the apothecary, steady and silent, played his role. Not healer, not dealer, but something in between. The shelves stretch higher than you can reach, jars stacked precariously, their contents glowing faintly in the lamplight. Shadows climb the walls, tall and thin, like ghostly sentinels keeping watch. You realize the shop itself is a metaphor. Rows of promises, all within reach, all glittering, all dangerous. And as you step back into the street, the little bell jingling cheerfully behind you, you carry with you not just a bottle but a piece of the shadow it casts. In this way, apothecaries became more than shops. They became quiet engines of transformation, turning bustling women into pale silhouettes, restless children into drowsy dolls, households into hushed tableaux of refinement. Their shelves of powders and tinctures didn't just soothe symptoms, they shaped a society that mistook ghostliness for grace. And the strangest part, everyone knew at least a little. They knew the bottles hollowed as much as they healed. They knew the powders blurred more than they cured. Yet the shelves stayed full, the counters stayed busy, and the apothecary's bell kept jingling. Because in a world where pain was constant and expectations unbearable, who could resist the promise of a powder, a bottle, a dream? You tuck the bottle into your pocket as you step away, the liquid sloshing softly, a reminder of what waits inside. The street outside feels harsher now, the cries of vendors sharper, the soot thicker, the air colder, but you know that once you're home, once you've poured a spoonful into your tea, all of it will soften again. And so, like countless others before you, you walk on, carrying your silence in a bottle, your ghostliness in amber glass. The mirror in your parlour does not lie, though you wish it did. You lean forward, peering into the glass as the gaslight flickers behind you, and what stares back is not the rosy-cheeked vitality celebrated in pastoral paintings, but something quieter, stranger. Your eyes are shadowed, ringed with soft grey hollows that look as though they've been smudged there by a careless artist. Your cheeks, once full, now slope inward delicately, almost elegantly. Your lips are pale, your skin faint. You look tired, but more than that, you look fashionable, because in the strange arithmetic of Victorian beauty, this hollow, fragile appearance is praised as refinement, the fashionable ghostly look. It isn't only you. In novels, heroines are described with wan beauty, ethereal languor, faces pale as lilies and fragile as snow. Artists paint women with soft pallor, their eyes cast downward, as if they are too delicate to endure the full glare of the world. Pale has become the new gold. In drawing rooms, women whisper compliments about how fragile so-and-so looks these days, how delicate her complexion, how finely her wrists taper like porcelain stems. Never mind that the pallor often comes not from poetry, but from teaspoons of laudanum dissolved in tea. The haze of narcotics becomes fashion, and fashion, once set, becomes law.
Imagine yourself walking into a crowded salon, the air thick with candle smoke and cologne, the chatter of voices rising like the clatter of porcelain cups. The women gathered there drift about like pale moths, their gowns rustling softly, their cheeks faintly flushed, not from health but from tinctures. They recline against velvet chairs, holding themselves as if the weight of their own arms is almost too much. Their laughter is gentle, their eyes distant, their presence softened until they seem more like apparitions than guests. And yet society claps politely, declaring them paragons of taste.
Fashionable ghostliness had many parents. Some of it came from illness, tuberculosis, or consumption, was rampant, and its sufferers, thin and hollow-eyed, were often described with a romantic glow. Some of it came from malnutrition, from tight corsets, from exhaustion, and some, undeniably, came from opium. Laudanum thinned bodies, shadowed eyes, dulled appetites. What should have been recognized as warning signs became celebrated as markers of refinement. Society mistook sickness for beauty, dependency for elegance, and pallor for purity. A satirical magazine once drew a cartoon of a lady at her dressing table, surrounded by bottles labelled fragility tonic, delicacy elixir, drops of one beauty. The joke was that women were buying illness to look fashionable, but like most satire, it was closer to truth than jest. Opium provided not just relief but an aesthetic. The thinness, the translucence, the softness of someone who seemed to live halfway between the world of the living and the world of ghosts. You stand before your mirror, dabbing powder onto your already pale cheeks, because fashion demands that you double down. Rouge is frowned upon, too blatant, too vulgar, but pallor is prized. So you sip your laudanum-laced tea, you skip meals, because corsets make breathing hard enough, and you float into social gatherings, looking exactly as society expects, ghost-like, delicate, refined. Never mind that your strength wanes, that your laughter grows thinner, that your days blur into each other. What matters is that you are beautiful in the strange, tragic way that Victorian England defines beauty. Writers noticed. Poets penned verses praising pale maidens with sorrowful eyes. Painters lingered on the hollow of the throat, the shadow beneath the cheekbone, the fragile hand holding a drooping flower. To be ghostly was to be idealized. Even death was romanticized. Heroines wasting away in novels were described as luminous, transcendent, otherworldly. It was as if society believed the closer you looked to fading away, the more perfect you became. Laudanum simply accelerated the process, ensuring that women didn't just appear delicate, they lived delicately, until delicacy blurred into disappearance. Think of how strange it is. Women praised for the very signs that signaled harm. The fashionable look of the day was not glowing health, but quiet decline. Pale skin meant you weren't labouring in the sun. Thinness suggested refinement. Hollow eyes spoke of sensitivity, and when laudanum delivered all these things in one convenient bottle, it became more than medicine. It became an accessory, not one you displayed openly, but one you wore in your very body. You lean back from the mirror, sighing, corset bones creaking faintly. The room feels still, your body light, your mind drifting. You wonder if anyone notices the difference between beauty and illness anymore, or if the two have simply merged into one. Perhaps that is the strangest part of all, that society managed to make ghostliness not just acceptable but desirable, a fashion trend that masked dependency under the veil of elegance. The drawing rooms reinforced it. Picture the gatherings, gentlemen discussing politics, ladies murmuring about music and literature. But always, the visual backdrop is the same. Pale faces, delicate wrists, quiet voices. The ghostly look dominates the room like wallpaper no one questions. Guests sip tea, sometimes laced with drops, and the haze spreads. Conversations drift, silences lengthen, and yet no one says the word addiction. Instead they say delicate, sensitive, exquisite, polite words to cover impolite truths. It wasn't only women. Men, too, indulged, though society judged them differently. A man weakened by laudanum was pitied, or mocked, or dismissed. A woman weakened by laudanum was admired. Her fragility was a performance, and the world applauded. It's almost comical, if you step back. The same hollow eyes, called tragedy in men, were praised as beauty in women. The double standard was as rigid as the corsets, and just as suffocating. The fashionable ghostly look seeped into every aspect of culture. Advertisements for face powders promised pale, refined complexions. Novels described women swooning, trembling, whispering, always half fading. And in the background, bottles lined shelves, feeding the look drop by drop. Addiction was not a private shame, but a public aesthetic, built into the very image of femininity. To be a Victorian woman was in many ways to be half vanished. You press your hand against the mirror, your pale reflection staring back with glassy eyes. Somewhere outside, life roars, carts rattle, children shout, factories thunder. But here inside, the silence feels thick, as though the walls themselves are participating in the charade, and you realize that the fashionable ghostly look wasn't just about appearance. It was about creating a society where women were present, but not too present, visible but not too vibrant, elegant but not too alive. And so, the look spread, carried by laudanum, corsets, starvation, expectation. Women faded into their roles, men admired the fading, and society carried on, convinced that fragility was beauty and that ghostliness was grace. The candle sputters as you lean closer to the writing desk, its wax pooling like melted patience. The paper before you is already smudged with ink blots, as though your quill were conspiring against you. Outside, the night presses hard against the windows. The fog of London, thick and damp, makes the gas lamps glow like tired moons. Your hand trembles slightly as you dip the pen, not only from fatigue but from the faint haze humming in your veins, because tonight, like so many nights, the words will not come without a dose. Laudanum, your ever-present editor, sits in its bottle by the candlestick, casting its amber shadow over your pages.
You are not alone in this habit. Writers of the age practically adopted Laudanum as a colleague, though an untrustworthy one. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, with his dream of Kubla Khan's pleasure dome, confessed that the vision had come during an opium sleep. Thomas de Quincey wrote his Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turning personal dependence into literary spectacle. Elizabeth Barrett Browning sipped laudanum to calm her chronic pain, her delicate lines fueled by teaspoons of narcotic hush. Even Charles Dickens is rumored to have dabbled when exhaustion wore at his nerves. The literary world, in short, was soaked in tinctures as much as ink.
Imagine Coleridge, late at night, wrapped in a dressing gown that smells faintly of damp wool and candle smoke. Laudanum bottle glinting on the side table. He tips a spoon into his tea, sips, leans back, and drifts into visions of distant lands, caverns, rivers, and domes of ice. His imagination unfurls like a carpet across the floor, brilliant and bizarre, but the carpet is woven with opium threads. When he wakes, the words are there, but so is the dependency, the trembling need for another spoonful, another dream. De Quincey turned his own habit into performance, writing in florid detail about the visions and nightmares that opium conjured. He described strolling through London streets, where every shadow seemed alive, where every sound vibrated through him like music. He painted opium as both muse and monster, a friend who whispers poetry in your ear while slowly stealing your bones. His book became a sensation, shocking some, intriguing many, inspiring countless readers to wonder what laudanum might do for their own imaginations. Ironically, his confession may have fueled as many new habits as it warned against. You picture yourself among them, scribbling feverishly by candlelight, the lines flowing smoother after each sip. At first, it feels like the drug is helping, sharpening focus, quieting distractions, unfurling imagination. The world softens at the edges, and within that softness, words glitter like hidden treasures waiting to be picked up. But the truth is quieter, more sinister. The laudanum doesn't give you creativity. It steals the noise so you think you hear inspiration more clearly. And when you try to write without it, the silence becomes unbearable, the pen refusing to move. What began as a tool becomes a crutch, and then a cage. Literary salons whispered about the practice. Some admired it, romanticized it, even envied it. To be an artist touched by opium seemed glamorous, dangerous in an attractive way, like walking always at the edge of twilight. Others whispered warnings, noting how many brilliant minds faded early. their health undone by dependence. Yet in the culture of the time, genius and fragility were often linked. As if to create beauty, one had to court destruction. The pale poet with the laudanum bottle became an archetype, admired even as he unraveled. And it wasn't only poets. Painters, musicians, thinkers. Many reached for the bottle when inspiration faltered or exhaustion weighed them down. You can almost hear the scraping of violins, the scratching of quills, the drip of paint onto canvas. All under the quiet supervision of laudanum, the drug became not just medicine but muse. Not just an escape, but a supposed gateway to higher imagination. Of course, what it truly offered was a narrowing tunnel. Visions vivid but costly, inspiration that left you weaker, emptier, and more dependent each time. Picture an evening gathering of writers in a smoky drawing room. The air is thick with pipe smoke, laughter, and the faint sweet sour smell of laudanum wine. Someone reads verses aloud, words lush and haunting. Another sketches characters on scraps of paper, eyes glittering with feverish energy. The conversation drifts from philosophy to politics to the beauty of dreams. Yet beneath the brilliance is a thread of fragility. The kind you recognize now: hollowed cheeks, trembling hands, laughter that rings a little too thin. They are praised for their genius, but the genius has been purchased, teaspoon by teaspoon, from a bottle that demands repayment in health, in vitality, in years. You lean back from your own desk, the quill heavy in your hand, the paper spotted with ink and fatigue. The room tilts slightly, as if the floor has grown softer, less certain. You wonder if the words you've written are truly yours, or if they belong to the tincture, whispered through you rather than born of you. Perhaps that's the cruelest trick of all. Laudanum convinces you it is helping even as it drains you, making you doubt whether your talent exists without it. Literary culture immortalized this paradox. Readers marveled at the beauty of opium-inspired works, yet the writers themselves often lived with despair, guilt, or physical decline. The muse that fueled them also consumed them. Ghostliness crept into their prose, their poetry, their very lives. And in a society already enamored with pale fragility, the line between brilliance and ruin blurred until it vanished altogether. You set down your quill, fingers smudged with ink, eyes heavy. The candle burns lower, its flame bowing like a weary performer. At the end of a long act, the bottle gleams beside it, innocent in its smallness, dangerous in its promise. You know you will reach for it again, because the words will not come without it, because the silence without it is too loud. And as you close your eyes, drifting into a haze that feels half dream, half death, you realize you have joined the ranks of those who wrote their way into ghostliness, one teaspoon at a time. The piano notes linger faintly in the parlor, uneven and hesitant, like someone trying to recall a melody they once knew by heart, but have since half forgotten. You sit among a circle of women, lace skirts gathered neatly, shawls draped like soft armor, the fire muttering in the grate. The tea service gleams on the low table, cups and saucers clinking as though they too are part of the conversation. And just at the edge of the arrangement, half hidden behind a plate of biscuits and seed cake, lies the bottle. Small, amber, unassuming, and yet it might be the most central guest in the room. The drawing room has always been the theatre of secrets. It is where polite society rehearses its smiles, sharpens its gossip, and carefully edits the truth into palatable phrases. Here, women whisper about their children's tantrums, their husbands' tempers, their own weariness disguised as delicate nerves. They do not complain outright. They allude, they hint, they laugh softly at their misfortunes, as if they are amusing anecdotes instead of bone-deep exhaustion. And amid the murmurs, someone always produces the tincture. It happens casually, almost invisibly. A friend leans forward, reaches into her reticule, and sets the bottle on the table with the same elegance as placing down a silver spoon. Another woman nods knowingly, as though they've rehearsed this exchange. No one makes a fuss. A teaspoon is poured into a teacup, stirred discreetly, sipped between bites of sponge cake. Then the bottle disappears again, tucked neatly out of sight. The conversation continues, smoother now, softer, punctuated by small sighs of relief. This ritual happens in parlours, across the city. In some houses, the bottle is disguised with perfumed labels or tucked into a case of cut glass. In others, it sits openly, treated as a household necessity, no more shameful than a bottle of sherry. Women share recipes for patentants the way others share recipes for puddings, which tonic best eases the nerves, which syrup calms the children fastest, which laudanum blend carries the fewest headaches the next day. Their voices drop, their eyes sparkle with the thrill of sharing something half forbidden, half essential. Imagine yourself seated among them. One woman confesses, in a whisper, that she takes an extra spoonful on nights when the children are particularly loud. Another admits she cannot get through church services without a discreet dose to soften the monotony of sermons. A third laughs, saying her husband believes she is naturally serene, when in truth serenity comes corked in a bottle. The laughter ripples, delicate and conspiratorial, weaving them together like stitches in fine lace. No one calls it addiction. They call it relief, refinement, composure. They call it whatever they need to call it so they can keep sipping. The strange part is how normal it feels. The drawing room, with its embroidered cushions and ticking clock, is not a den of vice. It is a stage of gentility. Yet here, behind the lace curtains and polished manners, women are dosing themselves into silence. And they are not ashamed. If anything, they are proud of their resourcefulness, their ability to maintain composure, their talent for balancing duty and survival with a teaspoon of amber liquid. It is a sisterhood of quiet endurance, and the bottle is their shared confidant. Sometimes the secrets go deeper. One woman, pale and trembling, whispers that she cannot stop. Her hands shake when she tries to go without. She hides bottles in drawers, in sewing baskets, behind books on the shelf. Another woman hushes her gently, squeezes her hand, and says, "We all do, dear. Best not to think too much of it." The group nods, murmuring soft affirmations, and just like that, the confession is absorbed, tucked neatly under the rug of polite denial. No one will speak of it again, because to name the danger is to risk unraveling the entire fabric of their calm. Outside these rooms, the world is harsher, the streets are crowded, the air thick with soot, the noise relentless. Men shout, carts rattle, factories grind. But inside, the drawing room glows with a false serenity. The walls hum with secrets. The air is perfumed with both lavender and laudanum, and the women recline as though floating just slightly above reality. They have built a sanctuary fragile but necessary, where the weight of the world is dulled by the weight of the bottle in their reticules. Magazines sometimes mocked them, sketching caricatures of society ladies lounging with drooping eyes, teacups in hand, oblivious to the chaos of the world outside. Yet those same magazines ran advertisements for tonics filled with opium, promising graceful composure and nervous relief. It was hypocrisy layered so thick you could frost a cake with it. But no one questioned it too loudly. After all, who wanted to disrupt the delicate arrangement of silence that kept households from collapsing under the pressure of expectation? And so, the drawing rooms hummed with half-truths and whispered doses. Women bonded not only over embroidery patterns or novels, but over shared recipes for relief. They traded tips, a few drops in wine before dinner, a spoonful before hosting guests, a stronger dose on nights when grief weighed heavy. It was a community of survival dressed up as elegance. Each woman knew at some level that she was not alone in her haze, and perhaps that knowledge, more than the laudanum itself, offered the deepest comfort. You lean back against the velvet cushion, cup in hand, the taste of tea mingled with bitterness on your tongue. Around you, the conversation flows gently, punctuated by laughter that is just a little too airy, by silences that stretch just a little too long. You feel lighter, your worries blurred, your body floating as though the fainting couch has sprouted wings. And in this moment, surrounded by women who share your secret, you almost believe the drawing room is not just a place, but a refuge, a sanctuary carved from shadows. But even sanctuaries have cracks. The more the bottles circulate, the more the silences deepen, Families begin to notice. Children tiptoe around mothers who drift through rooms like sleepwalkers. Husbands mutter about wives who are too quiet, too pale, too absent. Yet even then, the denial holds. Better a silent wife than a loud one. Better a ghostly mother than a restless one. Better a household shrouded in calm than torn apart by unrest. And so, the bottles keep appearing on tea tables, tucked discreetly among biscuits and sandwiches, passed like secrets from hand to hand. The drawing rooms remain both stages and hiding places, where refinement cloaks dependency, where whispers disguise cries for help, where ghostliness is cultivated like a fashion. You sit in the middle of it, sip your tea, and know the truth. The conversations here are not just about gossip or literature, they are about survival, whispered through teaspoons, stirred into silence, swallowed behind lace curtains. The fire crackles, the piano falters, the clock ticks. Outside, life roars. Inside, the drawing room hums with soft voices, clinking cups, and the faint, ever-present shadow of the bottle. And you realize, this room is not just a social gathering, it is a ritual, a communion of women and their amber confidant, whispering their way further into ghostliness, one polite sip at a time. The mill bell clangs in the distance, loud and metallic, dragging you from sleep before the dawn has even softened the horizon. The air in the cottage is damp and heavy, a mix of coal smoke and yesterday's stew clinging to your clothes before you've even buttoned them. You pull your shawl tighter around your shoulders, feet already sore before they hit the dirt floor. The day stretches ahead like a punishment carved in stone. 12, 14 hours at the loom, at the spinning frame, at the needle, your hands bleeding thread by thread. And on the table, next to the crust of bread that passes for breakfast, stands the bottle. Small, dark, ordinary, but for women like you, it is the only way the day can be survived. Laudanum, or one of its cheaper cousins, is not an indulgence here. It is necessity. For working-class women, opium tinctures and powders were the invisible scaffolding that kept bodies upright through shifts that would break an ox. Factories demanded speed, precision, endurance. Children wailed in overcrowded homes. Husbands staggered home from the pub, heavy with ale and disappointment. And there was never enough food, never enough coal, never enough time. The bottle promised to make all of that bearable, or at least quieter. You tip a few drops into your tea, if you're lucky enough to have tea, or straight onto your tongue if you're not. The taste burns bitter, but the warmth follows quickly, spreading through limbs stiff with exhaustion. The ache in your shoulders eases just enough that you can walk to the mill without cursing each step. The hunger in your stomach feels less sharp, the cold less biting. The world blurs at the edges, but that blur is a mercy. When the bell clangs again, calling you to your post at the loom, you can at least move forward. Inside the mill, the air is thick with dust, fibers floating like ghostly snowflakes, coating your throat and lungs until each breath rasps. The machines roar, wooden frames shuddering, metal teeth snapping, wheels turning with relentless rhythm. Your fingers dart through threads, tying, twisting, mending. A missed stitch means scolding. A broken thread means docked pay. Your body screams, but the tincture hums its lullaby. You are steady. You are calm. You are, for now, able to endure. Around you, other women do the same. Some are younger, some older. Their faces all carved by fatigue, shawls pulled close, hair tied back, hands flying automatically. You see the same glassy calm in their eyes, the same slight slackness in their movements, as if their spirits have been numbed to match the machines. You know their secret, because it is yours too. The bottle in the apron pocket, the drops taken before the shift, the spoonfuls saved for when the pain grows unbearable. You are not alone in your haze. Children, too, share in this ritual. Mothers slip soothing syrups into their mouths before sending them to work as piecers or scavengers in the mill. Small bodies crawling under machines to pick up fallen fibers. The opium dulls their hunger, quiets their fear, makes them easier to manage. The silence it buys is cruelly practical. A drowsy child won't protest. A dulled child won't cry when his hand brushes too close to the moving frame. The drug becomes part of the factory itself, woven into the rhythm of labor, as much as the spinning wheels. And then there is childbirth. For working class women, pregnancies come one after another, bodies battered by endless cycles of labor, both domestic and industrial. Pain is constant. Recovery, non-existent. Laudanum is the only reprieve. You take it to ease cramps, to dull the ache of miscarriages, to keep moving after delivering a child and returning to the mill too soon. No doctor comes to your bedside. No midwife has enough to offer. But the apothecary sells bottles cheaply, and so you keep buying, keep dosing, keep surviving. The cost, of course, is steep. Dependency sets in quickly. The doses grow larger, the bottles empty faster. When you try to go without, your hands shake, your stomach twists, your head pounds like the mill hammer. Yet what choice do you have? Without the drug, you cannot stand through the shift. Without the shift, you cannot feed your children. And so the cycle deepens, as inevitable as the turning of the mill wheel itself. Imagine the end of the day. The bell clangs again, releasing you into the dark. Your body aches in every joint. Your head spins from dust and noise. You walk home, feet dragging, shawl pulled tight against the damp air. In the cottage, the fire is low, the children restless, the husband drunk or sullen. You ladle out stew thin as sorrow, mop the floor, mend the socks, soothe the baby, and then, when the weight of it all presses too hard, you reach for the bottle again. The haze settles, and you slip into a half-sleep on the chair, the day finally blurred enough to endure. Social reformers occasionally noticed. Pamphlets circulated warning of opium eaters among the working class, painting lurid pictures of mothers too drowsy to care for their children, of families sinking into poverty because wages were spent on bottles. Some pamphlets were true, many exaggerated, all judgmental, but rarely did those reformers ask why. Why were the bottles needed? Why did women depend on them? The answer was too uncomfortable. Because society demanded superhuman endurance from women while giving them nothing in return. You look around your small cottage, the walls stained with soot, the furniture sparse and worn. The bottle gleams faintly on the mantel, its amber glow the only richness in the room. You know it is both friend and enemy, both relief and trap, but without it, how would you endure the mill, the children, the hunger, the exhaustion? In a life carved by endless demands, the bottle feels less like a luxury and more like the last thread holding you together. The fashionable classes may call it refinement when they sip laudanum in parlours. For you, it is survival. The ghostliness that creeps into your body is not admired but ignored. The side effect of poverty no one bothers to romanticize. You fade quietly, not because it is fashionable, but because it is inevitable. The bottle takes, but it also gives, and in the cruel math of working class life, that is enough.
Night deepens. The mill bell is silent at last. Your children sleep, their breaths uneven, their small faces pale. You sit by the fire, shawl around your shoulders, the bottle warm in your hand. You know tomorrow, the cycle begins again. The clang, the dust, the ache, the drops that make it bearable. And though you sometimes dream of breaking free, of waking without the haze, of living without the bottle's shadow, you also know the truth. Without it, survival would be impossible, and so you sip, you sigh, you surrender.
The flames sputter low, casting shadows across the walls that look like figures half formed, half fading. You watch them dance and realize they are your reflection, strong enough to endure, fragile enough to vanish, ghostly enough to pass unnoticed. And as your eyes close, heavy with both fatigue and tincture, the mill bell waits silently for the morning, ready to call you back into the endless cycle once more. The doctor's waiting room smells faintly of leather-bound books and stale pipe smoke, a mixture meant to reassure you that science and authority live here, though the odour mostly suggests old upholstery and indifference. You sit in a stiff-backed chair, corset laces digging, nerves fraying, waiting for your name to be called. On the wall hangs an engraving of Hippocrates, his solemn gaze implying that wisdom trickles down from ancient Greece to this modest practice in London. You half expect the engraving to cough politely and hand you a bottle of laudanum itself, just to save everyone the trouble. The door creaks open, the doctor side whiskers bristling, waistcoat snug, spectacles perched precariously, gestures you inside. You explain, carefully, that you've been tired, restless, plagued by headaches, overcome with vague unease, unable to sleep. He nods gravely, as though you've just confessed to the human condition. He asks a few perfunctory questions, checks your pulse, with all the enthusiasm of a man counting spoons, and scribbles something on a slip of paper. A tonic, he says, sliding the prescription across the desk. Laudanum, in modest doses, calms the nerves, steadies the constitution. Translation: I haven't the time or inclination to explore the complexities of your life, but here is the fashionable solution in a bottle. And he means it kindly, in the detached way a man means anything kindly, while adjusting his cuffs and wondering if his next patient is less complicated. Victorian physicians became the unwitting middlemen of dependency. Their training, steeped in theories of humours and temperaments, left them ill-prepared to grapple with chronic pain, depression or trauma. What they did have was access to opium, easy to prescribe, socially acceptable, profitable for pharmacies, and astonishingly effective in the short term. They didn't see addiction, they saw compliance. A patient who returned quieter, calmer, less disruptive, was in their ledgers. A patient improved, and so the bottles multiplied, handed out with the same casualness as peppermint lozenges. Women were dosed for female complaints, a phrase so elastic it could cover childbirth, menstruation, grief, or the audacity of raising your voice. Men were dosed for gout, for melancholy, for the strain of business. Children were dosed for teething, for coughs, for restlessness. Everyone, in short, was encouraged to sip their way into silence. Yet beneath this apparent benevolence lurked denial. Physicians noticed, of course, when patients returned more frequently, when doses needed to be stronger, when once occasional complaints became chronic. But instead of questioning the remedy, they often blamed the patient. Overindulgence, they said, as though the fault lay in women being too weak-willed to control their own teaspoons. Addiction was reframed as moral failing, never as medical oversight. In this way, doctors maintained their dignity, their authority, and their steady business. Imagine a doctor's study stacked with casebooks, his handwriting looping elegantly across the pages. Mrs. Pay, recurring nerves. Prescribed laudanum, 1 dractoring. Mrs. Pay, nerves continue. Prescribed laudanum, larger dractoring. Mrs. Pay, 1 and delicate. Seems calmer. Prognosis, improved. What the page does not note is that Mrs. Pay now drifts through her house like a pale shadow, her children watching her move as if underwater. To the doctor, improvement meant silence. To the family, it meant ghostliness. Pharmaceutical profits only deepened the denial. Apothecaries and physicians alike earned from the bottles they prescribed. Each cork popped meant another coin in the till. Laudanum was cheap to make. Opium imported, dissolved in alcohol, sold in bulk, and demand never waned. To question its use would be to question a thriving business model. And so doctors balanced their spectacles on their noses and told themselves what society wanted to hear. That laudanum was safe, that women were fragile, that quiet households were healthy ones. Of course, not every doctor was blind. Some began to write anxious papers about opium habitués, warning of patients who could not function without their daily dose. They described trembling hands, wasted bodies, haunted eyes. They cautioned about deaths from overdose, about infants too drowsy to wake. But those warnings circulated quietly in medical journals, read by a handful of concerned colleagues, and ignored by the rest. After all, what reform could come when laudanum was the only tool they trusted, the only medicine society would accept? You picture yourself again in that office, the doctor's desk polished, his quill scratching. He offers you a bottle as if it is kindness itself, and perhaps it is, in his limited imagination. He does not see your life beyond this room, the sleepless nights, the relentless duties, the quiet despair. He sees a set of symptoms to be hushed. He sees a patient to be managed. He sees a problem with an easy solution. And so he hands you the bottle, and you carry it home. And once again the cycle continues. What's most unsettling is how society trusted the medical men completely. To question a doctor was to invite ridicule. To suggest that laudanum caused more harm than good was to risk being labelled ignorant, hysterical, or ungrateful. Respectability was tied to obedience. If your doctor prescribed it, you swallowed it. If your doctor insisted it was safe, you smiled and agreed. Doubt was impolite. Compliance was praised. And in this compliance, the shadow spread. Think of the irony. A profession meant to heal instead became the supplier of ghostliness. Physicians who prided themselves on science handed out bottles that hollowed their patients, and then congratulated themselves when the patients returned quieter. The denial was almost theatrical, as if the entire medical establishment were actors in a play called We Pretend This Is Fine. Each prescription was a line of dialogue, each bottle a prop, each patient a performer cast as delicate invalid. And the audience, society at large, applauded. Women praised their doctors for their attentiveness. Husbands thanked them for their wives' serenity. Neighbours admired the improved household. No one admitted that improvement meant disappearance, that serenity meant sedation, that fragility was being cultivated. Teaspoon by teaspoon, you leave the doctor's office, prescription in hand, the cobblestones echoing beneath your boots. The fog curls around you like a conspirator. The slip of paper feels heavier than it should, as though it carries not only medicine but destiny. At the apothecary, the bottle will be filled, corked, and slipped into your basket, and when you take it home it will join the others on the shelf, another shadow in a room already full of them. The waiting room empties, fills, empties again. Patients come and go, each carrying their own slips of paper, their own amber futures. The doctors sit behind their desks, scribbling calmly, balancing their ledgers, adjusting their spectacles, and outside, the city grows quieter, more refined, more ghostly, one prescription at a time. It is a strange theatre, this medical denial. Everyone knows, at some level, what is happening. The patients know they are dependent. The doctors know they are enabling. The apothecaries know they are profiting. And yet the curtain never drops. The performance never ends. It goes on, night after night, bottle after bottle, until the very fabric of society is stitched with amber thread. You pause on the street corner, bottle in hand, fog pressing close. You realize the truth. The medical men, for all their authority, were not curing. They were colluding. Colluding with society's demand for silence, with husbands' demands for obedience, with industry's demands for endurance. Laudanum was not just a prescription. It was policy, written not in laws but in habits. And you, like so many others, are both actor and audience in the play. The fog thickens, the gas lamps blur, your steps carry you home. The bottle taps gently in your basket, steady as a heartbeat, inevitable as the doctor's script. And you know that when the shadows deepen again, when the nerves fray, when the silence grows too heavy, you will reach for it. Because the doctors say it is safe, the neighbours say it is elegant, and the truth, dangerous, ghostly, undeniable, remains locked behind the polished doors of the medical men in denial. The magazine lies open on the parlour table, its pages spread wide beneath the glow of the gaslight. On one side, an article solemnly warns of the dangers of opium, speaking in tones so severe you half expect the page itself to wag a finger at you. The creeping menace, it calls laudanum, describing women who waste away into shadows, mothers who forget their children, households undone by indulgence. The ink smells faintly sharp, as if it were printed in judgment. Yet on the very next page, the cheerful advertisement beckons. Miss Winslow's soothing syrup, safe, gentle, trusted by mothers for over 60 years. The ad features a plump baby smiling sweetly, cheeks round, eyes bright, held by a serene mother who looks as if she's had a full 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. You almost laugh, except that you know the joke is on you. This was the Victorian paradox: moral panic and cheerful promotion bound together in the same publication. Newspapers thundered about the dangers of female opium eaters, warning that England's households were at risk of dissolving into ghostly ruins. At the same time, they filled their classifieds with ads for cordials, tonics, tinctures, and elixirs, nearly all laced with opium. It was like a preacher denouncing sin on Sunday morning, and then handing out discount vouchers for it on Monday afternoon. You turn the page again. Another ad shows a drawing of a delicate woman in a lace bonnet, holding a vial labelled Laudanum for ladies. The copy promises relief from headache, nerves, melancholy, and all feminine difficulties. The font swirls elegantly, suggesting not danger, but refinement. You can almost imagine the advertisement itself leaning across the table to whisper, "Don't listen to the article on the other page, dear. You and I both know you need this." Public opinion grew louder as the century wore on. Clergymen preached about the perils of overindulgence, warning that women were slipping into moral ruin. Satirists drew cartoons of pale wives collapsed on sofas, bottles at their sides, husbands wringing their hands in despair. Reformers gave lectures, writing pamphlets with titles like "The Curse in the Cupboard" or "The Silent Thief of Homes." They warned of addiction, of infants dying in their cradles, of families undone by dependence. And yet, the advertisements kept multiplying. Patent medicine companies poured money into magazines and broadsheets, ensuring that no household could escape the cheerful promises of their products. For every stern warning, there were 3 bright ads, insisting that opium-laced remedies were the key to domestic harmony. Who were you to believe? The scolding preacher, or the smiling baby in the illustration? In a world already heavy with exhaustion, the baby usually won. Imagine yourself as a reader, curled on the fainting couch, tea cooling beside you, flipping through the latest issue of the Lady's Own Journal. The articles scold you for weakness, for indulgence, for slipping into dependency. The ads promise you relief, composure, serenity. It is like listening to 2 voices whispering in your ears at once, one stern, one sweet, both insistent. You sigh, set down the magazine, and pour another teaspoon from the bottle at your side. After all, the warning article leaves you anxious. The advertisement offers you peace. Which would you choose? Even politics dipped its toes into the debate. Parliament occasionally considered measures to regulate opium sales, spurred by reports of rising addiction. Committees convened, papers were read, witnesses testified, yet the measures often stalled, watered down by industry lobbying or simple public apathy. Too many people relied on the bottles, too many doctors prescribed them, too many newspapers profited from the ads. It was easier to wring hands about morality than to confront the economic machinery churning behind the scenes. This doublespeak seeped into daily conversations. Neighbours clucked their tongues at the poor creatures wasting away on opium, even as they poured a few drops of soothing syrup into their own children's cups. Husbands complained about their wives' dependence, even as they themselves dosed secretly for indigestion or melancholy. Doctors cautioned patients against overuse, then wrote another prescription without hesitation. Everyone knew, everyone denied. It was a national case of selective blindness, wrapped in lace and advertisements. And the magazines were the loudest chorus of all. Their pages swung between alarm and reassurance, judgment and seduction. You can almost see the contradiction inked side by side. A stern essay on the dangers of dependency, followed immediately by an advertisement illustrated with roses, promising that a spoonful a day keeps the tears away. It is a strange duet, a cultural argument performed not on a stage but in your living room. One voice warning you of ghosts, the other offering to sell you the very shadow that makes you ghost-like. You think of the women reading these pages late at night, the lamp casting shadows, the bottle already half empty on the table. They read the warnings with guilty hearts, then glance at the advertisements with longing. They know the danger, yet the danger feels distant compared to the immediate relief of silence, sleep, composure. Tomorrow's ghostliness seems less pressing than tonight's exhaustion. And so they dose again, as the magazines keep scolding and smiling in equal measure. Sometimes, the hypocrisy turned tragic. Families who lost children to overdoses were condemned not only by grief, but by shame, accused of negligence, of overindulgence, of weakness. Yet those same families often bought the syrup because the advertisements told them it was safe, because the apothecary sold it without question, because everyone they knew did the same. The public wanted to blame, but not to change. Blame was tidy, change was messy. You close the magazine with a soft thud, its pages whispering judgment and invitation all at once. On the table, the bottle glows faintly in the gaslight, as though aware it has allies printed in every newspaper across the country. The moralists shout, but the advertisers smile, and in a weary household, smiles win every time. You pour another spoonful into your tea, stir gently, sip. The taste is bitter, the aftertaste sweet. The warning fades, the relief lingers. This was the strange dance of Victorian society. Scold with one hand, sell with the other. Moral panic kept the topic alive. Advertisements kept the bottles flowing. Families lived caught between the two, reading warnings while dosing anyway, haunted by guilt but soothed by necessity. And in that tension, the ghostliness spread, encouraged as much by contradiction as by addiction. The fire crackles low, the clock ticks, the shadows grow longer. You lean back, magazine closed, bottle near, your body softening into the fainting couch. You know the dangers, you've read the warnings, but the baby in the advertisement smiles at you with round cheeks and serenity. And you think, perhaps one more spoonful, just tonight, just to quiet the nerves. And so the cycle continues, as it always has. One article of panic, one ad of promise, one dose of silence. The year has turned, and the winds of reform rattle the windows like impatient guests. Parliamentarians, journalists, and physicians alike begin to murmur more loudly about regulation, about control, about the need to rein in the bottles that now sit on nearly every mantelpiece in England. You sit at your parlour table, lace gloves folded neatly in your lap, listening to the echoes of debate drifting from the newspapers. They speak of laws, of bans, of licensing. Yet, as you sip your tea, softened of course with a drop of laudanum, you know in your bones that the laws are late, far too late, arriving only after ghostliness has already seeped into the wallpaper. Imagine the streets of London in the 1860s and 70s. Pharmacies hum with commerce, patent medicine stalls crowd the marketplaces, and advertisements still bloom across every surface. Opium is everywhere, in cough lozenges, in children's syrups, in soothing drops. By the time reformers push for restrictions, the entire city is already steeped in amber. Households run on it, factories depend on it, drawing rooms rely on it. To strip it away suddenly would be like removing the coal from the hearth, or the gas from the lamps. And so the lawmakers move cautiously, nervously, crafting regulations that attempt to sound stern without actually changing daily life. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 is passed, requiring that dangerous drugs, including opium, be sold only by registered chemists. It is a first attempt at control, a gesture more symbolic than sweeping. Laudanum can still be purchased, just not quite as casually as before. The apothecaries complain about paperwork. Reformers cheer a small victory. But for ordinary women, nothing changes. The chemists still sell. The bottles still gleam. The teaspoons still stir. Ghostliness does not vanish at the stroke of a pen. You picture a woman stepping into a chemist's shop after the law has passed. The shelves look the same, the jars and vials unchanged. The apothecary, spectacles perched as always, greets her with the same polite nod. She requests her laudanum. He measures it carefully, perhaps asking her to sign a ledger now. She leaves with the bottle tucked into a reticule, just as she always has. Outside, reformers may trumpet that progress has been made, but inside the homes of Britain, the amber ritual continues unbroken. Critics point out the futility. Writers in newspapers grumble that the law is a lion painted on paper, but a lamb in practice. Doctors, some more honest now, admit that the habit is too entrenched to uproot. One physician confesses in a letter to the Lancet that he has entire families dependent on opium, mothers dosing themselves and their children, fathers dosing secretly after long days of work. "What would you have me do?" he writes. "Cut them off? They would perish." His words are both excuse and truth. Reform comes, but it comes too late. Meanwhile, magazines continue their contradictions. Even as they report on the new laws, they still carry advertisements for safe tonics, each one just a clever disguise for the same narcotic core. The public reads about restrictions on one page and orders another bottle from the back pages. The cycle endures, fortified by denial and demand. Think of how many households already depended on the drug. The working-class mothers, who could not endure a shift at the mill without it. The middle-class wives, who found serenity in a teaspoon stirred into tea. The grieving widows who slept only with its haze. For them, the law was irrelevant. No act of Parliament could legislate away their pain, their exhaustion, their need for silence. And so they bought, they dosed, they endured. Some families, however, did begin to notice the change. Bottles became harder to obtain in bulk. Prices rose slightly. Apothecaries, wary of scrutiny, sometimes hesitated before selling larger quantities. And so women devised new strategies. They visited multiple chemists, spreading out their purchases. They sent servants or children to fetch bottles, avoiding the appearance of excess. They learned to hoard, to ration, to disguise. Ghostliness now required strategy, but it continued all the same. Imagine a parlour drawer lined with bottles, hidden beneath folded linens, a sewing basket, with a vial tucked among the threads, a handbag weighted not by coins but by amber liquid. Women became resourceful, creative, determined. Reform might slow them, but it could not stop them. Laudanum was no longer just medicine. It was woven into their lives, stitched into the rhythm of their days. Reformers grew frustrated. They wrote more pamphlets, gave more lectures, thundered in Parliament about the need for stronger laws. Some proposed banning laudanum altogether, but industry pushed back, arguing that it was a vital medicine, that countless lives depended on it, that restricting it further would cause more harm than good. And in a way they were right. By then, addiction was so widespread that withdrawal could be fatal. To remove the drug abruptly would have been to unleash chaos, and so the laws remained half measures, bandages on wounds that had long since festered. The irony is sharp. Victorian society prided itself on order, discipline, and morality, yet its households floated on rivers of opium, sustained by a silence that reform could not penetrate. Ghostliness had become part of the culture, part of the aesthetic, part of the very identity of womanhood. To outlaw it entirely would be to unravel not just habits, but ideals. And so the lawmakers settled for compromise, leaving the bottles in place even as they pretended to rein them in. You sit by the fire, the newspaper folded in your lap, reading about the new regulations. The article assures you that opium is now safely controlled, that abuses will diminish, that households will be protected. You glance at the bottle on the table, glowing faintly in the lamplight, and you smile at the absurdity. You know the truth. The law has not touched you. The bottle is still yours. The haze is still waiting. Reform is a performance, but dependency is reality. Outside, the world stirs with progress. Railways expanding, factories rising, science advancing. But inside the home, the same rituals continue, teaspoons stirring, women reclining, children hushed. Reform may have arrived on paper, but in practice the amber tide rolls on, unstoppable. Ghostliness remains, unshaken by laws too timid to matter. And so history moves forward, carrying with it not the end of laudanum, but its transformation, from household staple to regulated medicine, from parlour secret to public scandal, from open commerce to whispered habit. The law has entered the stage, but it has arrived too late, too gently, too politely. The bottles remain, the haze persists, and the ghostly figures drift through drawing rooms as though nothing has changed at all. The parlour is quiet, but it is not peace. The fire whispers in the grate, shadows cling to the wallpaper, and the clock ticks with the slow insistence of something that will not be ignored. You sit in a chair too stiff for comfort, staring at the figure across from you. She is your neighbour, or perhaps your sister, or maybe just the pale reflection you see in your own mirror. It hardly matters, for the ghostliness is the same. Her face, once lively, has thinned into sharp angles, softened only by the glow of the gaslight. Her hands tremble faintly as she pours tea, her wrist so narrow you fear the cup will slip. She smiles, faint, polite, but her eyes are distant, glazed by something far heavier than fatigue. It is the look you know too well, the quiet hollowing of laudanum. Families felt it first in the silences. Wives who once managed households with brisk efficiency now drifted through rooms like shadows, duties forgotten, tasks half finished. Conversations faltered as words slipped away into fog. Mothers who once scolded their children into order now simply pressed a vial into small hands, dosing away the noise. Husbands, at first relieved by the quiet, soon found it unbearable. A wife who argued was difficult. A wife who barely spoke was worse. Homes grew too still, too eerie, as if life had been pressed beneath glass. You picture a family supper. The table is laid with its modest spread. Bread, broth, perhaps a sliver of mutton. The children chatter restlessly. The father carves the meat, and the mother sits at the head of the table, her hands folded in her lap. She smiles faintly but eats almost nothing. Her eyes wander, unfocused, as though she hears the conversation from a great distance. When the baby cries, she stirs automatically, not with comfort, but with a bottle, tipping a few drops of syrup into a spoon and pressing it into tiny lips. The baby quiets. The family resumes eating. The silence swells. No one mentions it. Dependency had a way of hollowing not just bodies, but bonds. Marriages strained beneath the weight of absence. Husbands who once sought comfort in their wives now found only detachment. Some grew angry, accusing their wives of weakness, of indulgence, of failing in their duties. Others simply withdrew, leaving households adrift in two separate silences, the wife's narcotic haze and the husband's resentment. Children too felt the absence. Mothers who once sang lullabies now drifted into sleep before their children did, their voices slurred, their arms limp. Daughters grew up watching their mothers fade. Sons grew up puzzled by the ghost at the head of the table. And yet, the families rarely spoke openly. To acknowledge the problem was to invite scandal, to risk being marked as one of those households whispered about at church. So they maintained appearances. The curtains remained drawn, the parlour remained tidy, the fainting couch remained occupied. Guests were entertained with tea and polite chatter, though everyone noticed how quickly the hostess's laughter faltered, how easily her attention drifted. The denial was a performance, and families became its actors, playing their parts with weary dedication. Sometimes, though, the cracks showed. Imagine a daughter rushing to her mother's side, frightened by her collapse on the floor. The doctor is summoned, the father pale with worry, the neighbours whispering at the garden gate. The doctor prescribes more carefully this time, perhaps warning against excess, but he still leaves another bottle behind. The daughter, relieved her mother is alive, watches as the cycle begins again. And though she resolves silently never to become the same, years later, she too finds herself reaching for the bottle, repeating the ritual she once feared. Dependency did not simply destroy households, it replicated itself within them. Children raised in the haze often grew into adults, who saw the bottle as ordinary, inevitable. The ghostliness passed down like an inheritance, not written in wills, but etched in habits. Families unravelled quietly, not in bursts of scandal, but in the slow erosion of presence. A mother fading, a father withdrawing, children growing in silence. The damage was less dramatic than fire or ruin, but no less complete. You lean back in your chair, listening to the quiet house around you. Somewhere upstairs, a child coughs. In the next room, a husband snores softly, the sound edged with ale. You sit alone with your tea, the laudanum bottle glowing faintly on the table, its amber liquid catching the firelight like a captured sun. You know it has already taken pieces of you, your laughter, your focus, your appetite. You wonder what else it will claim. Your marriage, your children's trust, your very sense of self. The thought drifts through you like smoke, half-formed, then dissolves. You sip again, and the worry fades, dulled into quiet. Families unravelled, not with screams but with sighs, not with battles but with silences. The ghostliness seeped into parlours, bedrooms, nurseries, turning vibrant homes into muted stages. Neighbours whispered, magazines scolded, doctors denied, and through it all, the bottles gleamed on mantels, quiet and constant, the only companions never absent. Imagine the parlour at dusk, the fire dying low, the family gathered but apart, each wrapped in their own silence. The mother reclines pale and distant, the father hides behind his newspaper, the children whisper in the corners. The house is full, yet it feels empty, and in that emptiness, you understand what Laudanum truly stole. Not just health, not just vitality, but connection. It hollowed the bonds between people until only the appearance remained, like furniture polished until it gleamed, though its wood was rotting inside. The tragedy of dependency was not always dramatic collapse, but the slow fading of intimacy, the quiet unravelling of love. Families did not break with a snap. They thinned like lace worn through at the elbows, until one day there was more hole than fabric, and still the bottle remained, standing silently on the mantel, the only constant presence in households where human presence was growing ghostly. The fire finally gutters. The clock ticks past the hour, and you rise to close the curtains against the night. The room feels too still, too heavy, its silence echoing louder than any noise. You glance once more at the bottle, amber glowing in the dim light. Families may unravel, bonds may fade, children may grow wary, husbands resentful, wives ghostly, but the bottle remains. It has become the heart of the household, beating steadily in its glass prison, promising relief, delivering silence, watching as everything else quietly comes undone. The portrait on the wall is almost smug in its ghostliness. A young woman, pale as parchment, stares out with hollowed eyes and lips barely tinted by colour. Her dress is a froth of lace and silk, her shoulders narrow, her posture impossibly delicate to modern eyes. She looks ill, as if caught mid-fever. But to the Victorians who admired her likeness, she was the very picture of refinement. Fragility had become a cultural masterpiece, painted, praised and passed down as an ideal, and behind that ideal lay the steady drip of opium. You glance again at your own reflection in the mirror, and you see the same features the portrait exalts, the faint shadow beneath your eyes, the softness in your jawline, the languid droop of your shoulders. These signs, which in truth signal exhaustion and dependency, are read by society as elegance. The strange transformation is complete. What was once private suffering has been translated into public virtue. You are applauded not for your strength, but for your fading. Ghostliness itself has been sculpted into beauty. Literature hardened this image. The heroines of the age drift across novels with pale cheeks, trembling hands, eyes luminous with sorrow. They faint gracefully, sigh melodically, and move through parlours like phantoms in silk. Their fragility is not portrayed as illness, but as a lure. Men are drawn to them, not in spite of their weakness, but because of it. To be won, to be ghostly, to be delicate, this is presented as the height of womanhood. The laudanum bottle becomes invisible in these portrayals, erased by the fiction that women are naturally ethereal, naturally fragile, naturally ghost-like. Think of the paintings hung in galleries. Women with translucent skin, their veins almost visible, their bodies draped like wilted lilies. Their beauty is spectral, hovering just this side of death. And viewers, instead of recoiling, sigh at the loveliness. Fragility becomes the aesthetic currency of the age. It is a cruel economy. Women trade their vitality for acceptance, their strength for admiration. their health for the illusion of refinement, and all the while the amber bottles work silently in the background, ensuring that fragility can be purchased by the spoonful. You imagine a ball, the chandeliers glittering, the orchestra swelling with Strauss. Women glide across the floor in gowns of silk and satin, but many of them do so with laudanum humming in their veins. Their smiles are soft, their laughter muted, their bodies light not from joy but from sedation. And yet the men look on admiringly, whispering to each other about the delicate charm of their partners, their ethereal grace, their ghostly beauty. No one says the word drug. They call it elegance. They call it fashion. They call it exactly what society demands. Magazines reinforce this ideal with ruthless consistency. Advice columns instructed women to cultivate pallor, to avoid the vulgar flush of sun-kissed skin, to prize instead the translucent look of porcelain. Poems lauded the fading flower, the wan angel, the fragile star. Even advertisements hinted that tinctures were not merely remedies, but enhancers of refinement, promising not just relief but composure, serenity, the look of delicate grace. Laudanum didn't only quiet pain, it curated an aesthetic. It sculpted women into the statues society wanted to display, beautiful, silent, ghost-like. You can almost hear the echoes in the drawing rooms. "My dear, you look positively ethereal," one woman says to another, noting the shadow under her eyes, the languor in her movements. It is offered as a compliment, and it is received as one. No one mentions the bottle that makes such ethereality possible. To do so would be impolite. Instead, they repeat the script of refinement, reinforcing the ideal until it hardens into cultural law. And so, fragility becomes both mask and mirror. Women wear it as armor, knowing it earns them praise. Men expect it, convinced it signals virtue. Society frames it, paints it, writes it, sells it. Ghostliness itself becomes the defining trait of femininity, as if to be alive fully, vibrantly, strongly, were to be unfashionable, even immoral. The paradox is suffocating. Women are celebrated only when they appear close to vanishing. You lean back, corset pressing, laudanum haze softening your edges. You know the price of this beauty. The hollowness in your body is no accident. The pallor in your face is no gift of nature. It is the consequence of teaspoons poured night after night, of a culture that mistakes sedation for grace. And though you might wish for colour in your cheeks, strength in your limbs, laughter that rings with life, you also know such vitality would draw scorn, whispers of vulgarity. To be admired you must fade, to be praised you must vanish. The ghostly aesthetic lingers long after the bottle is set aside. It seeps into portraits, into novels, into memory itself. Generations look back at these images and believe them to be natural, forgetting the chemistry that carved them. The paintings still hang, the poems still circulate, the novels still whisper of fragile heroines. They are echoes of an addiction disguised as fashion, a cultural memory that mistakes illness for beauty. You stare again at the portrait on the wall, her pale face glowing faintly in the dim light. She seems serene, perfect, untouchable, but you know the truth. She is not just a woman, she is a reflection of the tincture, a symbol of a culture that prized ghostliness above life. She is not serenity, she is silence. And silence, like laudanum, is both seductive and deadly. The room around you feels heavy, the fire low, the bottle gleaming on the table. You realize that the cultural ideal you are living is less a choice than a trap. It has been painted, written, praised and sold until it feels inevitable. Ghostliness has been hardened into identity, and you, like so many others, are caught in its amber glow, admired for your fading, applauded for your vanishing, praised for being beautiful only as long as you are disappearing. The portrait watches silently as you take another sip, the taste bitter, the aftertaste sweet. You lean back, eyelids heavy, and realize that the ghost of refinement has already become you. You are both subject and symbol, patient and portrait, alive and half vanished. The fashionable look, has hardened into truth, and in that truth, you understand this ghostliness will outlast you. It has already outlasted countless others. It will linger in art, in literature, in memory, long after the bottles are empty. The night outside is still, the fog lying low across the streets like a heavy blanket, muffling the wheels of carriages and the footsteps of late stragglers. Inside, the fire burns low, its glow no more than a cluster of embers, pulsing faintly in the grate, as if reluctant to let go. You recline in your chair, the bottle of amber liquid resting on the table beside you, nearly empty now, its glass glowing faintly in the dim light. You feel it in your body, in your mind, in the way your limbs seem lighter than air yet heavier than lead. The ghostliness has become you, and as you sink into that realization, you know you are part of a story larger than yourself, a story woven into the very fabric of Victorian life. The drug that turned women into ghosts did not vanish when the bottles were corked for the last time. It left traces in literature, in portraits, in whispered family stories that trickled down generations. Even as stricter laws finally tightened their grip, limiting sales and shaming public indulgence, the echoes of Laudanum lingered. It had already shaped ideals of femininity, had already rewritten the cultural script to equate fragility with beauty, silence with virtue, absence with refinement. Those ideals would take far longer to fade than the opium haze itself. Imagine a parlour, years later, the bottles finally tucked away, replaced by safer tonics, by newer medicines. The fainting couch still stands, the piano still gleams, the curtains still hang heavy with lace, but something remains missing, though no one speaks of it aloud. The women of the house still carry the look, the hollow eyes, the pale skin, the soft voices. Even without the bottle, the ghostly ideal endures, etched so deeply into expectation that it no longer requires the tincture to sustain it. What began as chemistry has become culture, and in this, perhaps, lies the greatest tragedy. Addiction could be curbed, habits broken, laws enforced, but the ideal, the belief that women must be delicate, fragile, ghost-like to be admired, it seeped into the 20th century, into fashion, into art, into beauty standards that still whisper their echoes today. To be thin, to be pale, to be ethereal, these remain markers of desirability, the laudanum ghost refusing to leave entirely. History's most dangerous habits rarely vanish. They linger, dressed in new names, disguised as progress. You sit in the quiet, listening to the house around you. Upstairs, the children sleep, their breaths uneven, their futures uncertain. In the next room, your husband shifts in his chair, sighing in his sleep. The clock ticks steadily, impartial, indifferent. And you drift, not just from the tincture, but from the weight of everything it has carried. The exhaustion of mothers, the despair of widows, the demands of fashion, the denial of doctors, the hypocrisy of magazines, the too late hand of the law. All of it swirls in the amber glow, leaving behind the same refrain. Women were asked to endure more than humanly possible, and society handed them ghostliness as the solution. Tonight, the haze feels heavier. You realize how many women must have ended nights just like this, staring at an almost empty bottle, wondering how they had come to depend on it, knowing yet not knowing, caught between relief and ruin. Their stories were rarely told. They faded into family silences, into portraits on walls, into novels that romanticized their fragility, without naming the drug behind it. They became, quite literally, ghosts of history, and perhaps that is why we tell their story now, to give shape to what was hidden, to give voice to what was silenced. The wind rattles faintly at the window. The fire sighs. You close your eyes, letting the heaviness settle, and for a moment you see them all, the women across parlours and nurseries and mills, each holding her own bottle, each sipping her way into silence. You see the poets scribbling feverishly under candlelight, the apothecaries measuring draughts, the doctors scribbling prescriptions, the reformers shouting too late. You see the lace curtains, the fainting couches, the children hushed, The families unraveling quietly behind closed doors, and woven through it all, you see the ghostliness, not supernatural, but cultural, a haunting made of habit and expectation. Now the haze softens, the room quiets, and the wind down begins. You feel your breath slowing, your body sinking deeper into the chair. The words come more slowly now, as if each one must pass through water before reaching your ear. And that is as it should be. The story has wound its long, strange path, and now it must settle, as embers settle into ash. So let the pace soften. Picture the room dimming, the fire sighing its last warmth into the air. The curtains hang heavy, unmoving, as though time itself has stopped at the edge of this parlour. Your body feels heavier now, safe in the stillness. Your mind drifting as softly as lace on a breeze. The ghostly women you followed through this story step back into the shadows, their bottles fading with them, leaving only echoes, faint, fragile, unforgettable. Let your breath deepen, let your shoulders release. The tick of the clock is slower now, more like a heartbeat than a command. Outside, the fog wraps the city in silence. Inside, you rest. You are safe here, in the hush of history, in the company of stories too strange and too human to ever be fully lost. And so, as the final images fade, the amber bottles, the lace curtains, the pale reflections in the mirror, let yourself fade too, not into ghostliness, but into rest. Rest, because you have carried the weight of this story. Rest, because the night is long, but the silence here is gentle. Rest, because even history must soften eventually, slipping into dreams. Now, close your eyes. Let the embers glow faintly. Let the room blur into warmth. Let the voices of the past settle into whispers. And know, as you drift, that you are not alone. We are here together, in the quiet, in the shadows, in the strange, soft company of history. Sleep now, and let the ghosts rest with you.